All right, welcome to episode 4 of the Rocket Science Podcast. On this episode, I have my friend Matyson Frazier on, and we started the episode off just kind of discussing the current climate and state of the sport of powerlifting, kind of the trajectory we see that being on. From there, we started jumping into just general tips for newer lifters. Kind of started off discussing different ways we see newer lifters kind of discovering the sport and how they are being introduced to the sport and how that can maybe affect their mentality towards their training. After that, we jumped into the pros and cons of hiring a coach right away versus self-coaching for a little while, kind of trying to figure some things out for yourself and different benefits to both of those strategies when prepping for your first meet or first few meets even. And then after that, we discuss kind of the pros and cons of different federations and how maybe it doesn't matter as much where you're competing, and it's more so mattering that you're supporting the kinds of communities and people you do want to be supporting within the sport. So just kind of jumped around a little bit, new powerlifter stuff, kind of the state of the sport in general, kind of into one episode. So if you enjoyed this episode, leave a like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. You can rate it on Spotify. We're on Spotify and YouTube. All of my links, as well as all of Matyson's links, are going to be down below in the subscription. So go check us all out, both of us out on Instagram. Everything should be linked down below.
How we doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
Good, good.
What are you up to today?
Just hanging out. I had some programming this morning, but now we're on here gonna talk about some powerlifting stuff, beginner powerlifter related info. So, um,
Okay, sweet.
uh,
Where do you want to start with it?
well, one thing I want to touch on is how kind of the growth of the sport and how a lot of people are kind of getting into it. Because I've noticed, I'm told that TikTok is kind of a big thing in the sport. I'm not involved on TikTok at all, but I feel like a lot of I feel like we see a lot of these teen lifters kind of come in and I guess I don't know if you've seen kind of the way they're coming in the sport, but like we see a lot of growth with people coming in through these different social media avenues. I don't know if that's something you've seen or not, but
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that if people are, especially younger lifters, right, like getting into the powerlifting, it's definitely very social media influenced. And I think that's like a double-edged sword. Like on one end, it's really good because it gets the most exposure for the sport, right? Like no matter where you think the state of powerlifting is right now, it's undeniably like the most popular it's ever been. Like
Mhm.
there's, the most amount of people, I mean, from my perspective, I feel like the most amount of people in combination with competitively doing it and just recreationally doing it, I feel like we're at the highest level of people being interested in it that I've seen. And I feel like you look over the course of years, like in through the 2000s to now, we also see like, the ceiling for strength me blown up. People used to think what was the max that someone would ever be able to do in 2015 is now like people are looking at 2025 and like a 10 times body weight total is like the expectation for the highest level lifters
Mhm.
and stuff like that. But was coming into it, like you have the positive side of bringing so many people into the sport, and then the more people that we're in, we see a higher skill ceiling. We see good coaches rise up with good methodologies. On the other hand, when things are just influenced by social media, there's the element of just doing it performatively, or for it like being cool and in. And I definitely do think that a lot of people get into it for the wrong reasons. They whatever they like lifting, they are at the gym for a year, they see people powerlifting, and then they just get into it because they see it online. They see, Russ, or they see the Gavin and Keiko clip, or they see something like that, and they're like, oh, I'm going to jump into it now. And they see stuff on TikTok, they see stuff on Instagram, and then that kind of ties into the burnout stuff that I know we've talked about in other
Mhm.
conversations and stuff. But you definitely see people where they have such a high degree of buy-in from everything that they see online. They get like super convinced, like, oh, this is for me, this is for me, this is for me. And then they do it for a little while, and maybe their social media feed changes, and or they realize that they're not keeping up with, some of their peers at similar ages and stuff like that, and discourages them from continuing to do so because they did get exposed to it and influenced by it in a very performative, like posting your PRs online sort of thing versus getting into it because you love the process of lifting and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I see like so I came in the sport when Russ was this is like 2019 Nationals timeframe. That's when I was introduced to powerlifting specifically. I was into kind of strength training stuff. I was watch the different YouTube channels and stuff, but that's what got me into the sport. So I think overall it's a good thing, like that we have social media and that we can see these highlights and stuff. But it does bring an interesting mindset, I think, for a lot of the younger lifters, because a lot of people are there, and Chris just had a post on this, but a lot of people seem to be like all in, and it's everything or nothing. And I don't think that's the best mindset to kind of have. And we've seen like the growth of sports in a good spot, and regardless of the concerns that I mean, we'll get into federations and stuff, but some of the concerns with federations and how many there are, and I still don't think that's necessarily hurting the sport um too much, and we'll cover that some, but there's a lot of opportunity to compete. And I know like when I started in Nebraska, um this is even like 2021-ish time frame. There was like 2 or 3 meets a year. That was it. And now there's two or
Yeah.
three meets a season. They probably put on 8 or 9 meets a year, very consistently. So the sport has definitely grown, and I think that's that's on, in part of social media, but I think also just, a lot of people kind of getting into directing meets and that sort of thing.
Yeah. The when you what you said about like getting into it around that time frame and just how many meets there were, like you did your, like you said, 2021-ish time frame.
Yeah.
2020 is when I did my first meet, and it was a USAPL meet, but I'm sure you're not familiar with the cities of Idaho by any means, but it is a somewhat long state. And so I'm from northern, and I went to school in a relatively northern part of Idaho. And the only meet opportunities that I had starting out was either driving down towards southern Idaho to Boise, which is like a 5, 6 hour drive, or going west into Washington to Spokane, which wasn't as long of a drive, but like either I had to go engage in Washington powerlifting, or I had to drive to state capital in order to find a meet to do. And like that was pretty much the only options that I had starting out. And thankfully, it's grown a little bit more, but or in the Idaho area. And now I'm in Washington, on the west side of Washington, so it doesn't really affect me as much, since there's a much larger Washington presence of powerlifting than there is in Idaho. But even from there, it was like Idaho had maybe 2 to 4 meets a year across all federations, and now I think they're closer to like that 5 to 10 range. So, even in whatever 4 years since when I started, it's basically doubled in the amount of meets that are happening and stuff. So I don't, like I said, and we were talking about, like, I don't think there's any doubt that like the sport has grown and is growing, and that the influence of social media is a big part of that, of course. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see where it goes, because I don't necessarily want to say that like powerlifting's on the downtrend or anything like that. But I do think that we were on a incline popularity for a while, and now we're sort of leveling out with the amount of eyes that it brought to the sport. And I'm interested to see where it goes from here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the federation stuff, like I said, we'll get into, but I don't think that's necessarily hurting the growth of the sport, but it is kind of breaking the growth up and segregating the sport into different groups. You got your USAPL, you've got your PA, and then you got your untested side, which has a bunch of different federations as well. Um, but yeah, like in Nebraska, I was just kind of covering like there was like 3 meets a year. That was just USAPL. That's not, obviously at the time PA wasn't a thing, but that's not including any untested federations. So those have obviously grown in the area too. There's more meets than just USAPL meets here. I think they're doing like 2 to 3 PA meets a year now, or Powerlifting America meets. But yeah, I think the growth of the
Sure.
sport, I think a lot of that we can contribute to probably like meet directors too, like in the local area. I know in Nebraska, our state chair, Katie Dodge, has done a great job, in my opinion. I really liked the job she's done with putting meets together and just having consistent meets for people to compete at. I'm sure the same thing in the Idaho area, Washington area. But
Yeah,
um,
everything has its ups and downs, its ebbs and flows, but regardless, I mean, better, I mean, I would say on average, right? Not everywhere is going to be the same, but on average, you definitely are seeing more meet directors who have a passion for the sport getting into it.
yeah. Yeah, and I think more people who want to bring like a high production value. Like I've just noticed a lot of meets. I know this is big on the East Coast, but I feel like we're starting to maybe get there a little bit in the Midwest more. But on the East Coast, like it seems like every meet that the TSP guys are at is this very high production value meet. Like it looks like a regional event. but it's just their,
Yeah.
run-of-the-mill local gym meet. So, I think we're starting to get there in the Midwest. I don't know what it's kind of like on the East Coast. I know I had one client do um, a meet in California that was pretty high production value. Like they had smoke and, lights and stuff behind them. In Hawaii holds.
It definitely, yeah, definitely depends. Yeah, like Hawaii, like Yukio stuff. We like in Nevada, like the Fighter Quit gym, they do crazy production stuff. One of my clients is like on their media team and stuff, and all the stuff that they do is pretty crazy. Washington side, Idaho, Oregon, that sort of three states up in the northwest corner. Definitely Washington is like you're gonna get I would say the highest level that I've seen between those three states. Washington probably has the highest quality of meats to offer, but I would say I don't know the majority of meats done here are more to like local level to accommodate the amount of interest in powerlifting. I don't think we've really reached that production value point on average. There is meat directors here in both USAPL and Powerlifting United now, not WRPF because our whole state flipped, but we'll talk about that
Yeah,
later.
we can talk about that because that affected me.
But yeah, so yeah. But it's like so there's people over here who are wanting to lean into the higher production value, try out a prime time session, things like that. And I'm excited to see that continue to happen because I think that that is like the next natural step for what we need to happen in order for it to be elevated here. I think that like Idaho, Oregon area probably still need to establish that local scene a little bit more, just having standard meats that people aren't paying, $150 registration for a higher quality meat they can, put on a bit more budget friendly meets that aren't putting
Mhm.
quite as much into the media and the venue and things like that just to grow the sport and get people involved. And then once that happens, I feel like the natural progression that needs to occur is that slow raise of production value. And of course, this is coming from someone who doesn't. I have never meet directed. I've just refereed and competed and handled and stuff like that. But I definitely think that that's the path that I've seen work most effectively. Like there's a guy here in and Cam is Cam Cavanaugh. And he did his first meet last February, and they're doing their second one this coming February. And like he was the first guy in my memory really recently. Like he had like smoke and like I guess I would say a bit more hip tracks going
Mhm.
when people were competing. Not necessarily the same, 80s, 90s rock and roll that you might get at other local meets around here. Um, but yeah, so there's definitely a growing production value on the side, and I'm excited to see it continue up that way. But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited with the trajectory. I think like we know Eric and he's holding meets up on the East Coast and we've seen how much he puts into them. I've been looking into potentially directing a meet. I have a friend of mine who we've kind of been bouncing that idea around a little bit now. We'd have to get some more information on that and stuff, but that would be the direction we would like to go is to kind of hold a
yeah,
like maybe a higher production value, like more hyped up meet that maybe like the local community can kind of get behind and get
yeah.
interested.
You
I do
should.
think though,
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, obviously you should talk to Eric because he knows a lot about running meets.
Yeah.
But you should also keep in touch with Andrew Salem, because he's going to be doing, his Rhode Island, getting into that for the first time, and I'm sure. Well, I mean, Eric is obviously going to have the most information about the most amount of things. I'm sure that getting into meet directing now is a lot different than it was when Eric started getting into meet
Mhm.
directing. So Andrew probably, having that ABC steps of what's happening in 2024, 2025 would probably be good to get info on too.
Yeah. Yeah. I just talked to someone yesterday actually in the gym who just held a meet. He just held his first meet and I was talking to him yesterday about just some of the introductory steps and stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a good segue kind of to get into just talking more, new powerlifters kind of coming in this where we kind of talked about the state of where we see powerlifting at and the meet uh I guess the meets across the country and just different areas. So obviously we see a lot of these people like younger kids and stuff or just not even kids. I mean just adults getting in the sport too. Like the sport's just growing. and we see people coming in through social media. Do you feel like that? I mean, we kind of talked about the effects of that, but do you feel like sometimes the mindset of people coming over from like seeing your Gavin Aidens and your Russ Orhis and your Wheezes getting into the sport, do you feel like that can bring some negative emotions with their own lifting when someone's coming in? Like, I know in my experience, sometimes you get people to come in and they want everything to be like an Instagram highlight reel. As we know, training is not always an Instagram highlight reel. And it may be for certain parts of the year when you really catch fire, but for a lot of the year, training is not always the most exciting thing. I don't know if you've seen similar things with your clientele or just people in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it happens. It's definitely more prevalent in the younger lifters, kind of like we discussed, like someone who started powerlifting in 2010 and is still powerlifting now. Like, obviously, they got into it when people weren't making reels and TikToks about powerlifting. And so that person's not really going to be that affected by the evolution of how people are getting into it now. And like you discussed with younger people getting in. But I mean, it's like kind of we talked about before, it creates that illusion of everything is going to be a highlight reel, everything can be good in training. And it's speaking on those guys that you mentioned and other lifters out there too, that people mostly post when things are going good. There's not a lot of people who are posting highlight reels through an injury. There's not a lot of people posting highlight reels through when they have to take a break from powerlifting to focus on a financial situation or a family emergency or something like that, right? So, and I think, say for example, a guy like Russ. I mean, he's the easiest example, one of the most prevalent on social media right now, is like, if he goes through an injury or if he had something big happen in his personal life, I'm sure that would affect his social media content, uploads, and everything like that. And I'm sure that he would post, some stuff still because it's what he does. It's how he makes a lot of his money and stuff is being very prevalent on social media as an influencer in the sport. But it would go from however many reels he's making a week or posts he's making a week about his training would probably get cut in half or lower, or maybe he would just stop making stuff like that altogether. And most people, I mean, they like if you're into the sport, you probably notice that his stuff is like not getting posted as much, or if you follow him, you'd probably notice that. But the majority of people would just kind of like tune it out because again, they're looking for things going well in other people.
Mhm.
Like you're going to see other people's highlight reels and you're just going to assume things are probably doing well for him. Like I said, unless you're really attuned to like his training and all that stuff. But kind of going back to what you were talking about primarily of people getting into it is I just think people focus too much on the progress that others make in contrast to their own training. It's really easy to look at someone else's training going well when you're in a rut or you're working through something and think like, oh man, my programming sucks, or I'm not making the progress that I should be making. Like, what am I doing wrong? This, that, all those things can come into play. And it's not like it's abnormal to plateau or have a lift progress. Like those are normal things that everyone experiences at some point or other in their lifting journey. Is you do something that works for a while and then all of a sudden your lifts kind of stagnate or the same things aren't working anymore and you have to figure that out. And everyone experiences that in some capacity. Obviously, the highest level lifters, it's way less noticeable. I mean, again, I'll just keep using Russ because he's easy to use. But I mean, like it's not like a secret or anything. Like notoriously bench presses his lift that like really takes a hit whenever he cuts into competition, or sometimes you'll have preps where bench just isn't clicking for him and stuff like that. And he'll just post squats and deadlifts. He just doesn't even post his bench at all. And like we see then it come around to obviously things like worlds. And I'm not going to say that Russ lost first place in worlds because of his bench press, but you do see those things then and that they have, an effect and stuff like that. But I mean, he's a multi-time national, multi-time world champion, and like even he has those issues on a lift. It just doesn't really get pointed out to the same way that someone who maybe is struggling with getting over like 300 pounds on bench might feel discouraged by their lifting. But yeah, I don't know. I think that people just are pretty ordinarily looking for the best in other people's training and picking out the worst in their training and comparing it a lot. And I think that that's definitely one of the negatives that comes with social media.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you make a really good point with Russ, and this just kind of translates to all high level lifters. It's not always a highlight reel. Those guys have bad training too, or subpar training. Um, and that's normal, right? That's part of the sport. And one thing I've talked about with one of my younger lifters is if your goal is to be if your goal is to be in powerlifting for a long time, and your goal is to be a good like open lifter someday, or even junior lifter someday, we're worried about now. Yes, like that's important. We want to place well now and all of that. We want to get as good as we can now. But if we blow you up and then snap your knee up and all of a sudden, I mean, we've seen Devin hasn't squatted now in like a couple months. If we run into an issue with someone kind of, where they get hurt and they're never the same again. We've seen this with a lot of younger lifters kind of coming into the sport where obviously Devin's not a younger lifter in the sport, but we see this where lifters get
Yeah,
really,
he's an
really
old
strong.
man.
They're like a teen. They yell and scream a lot on Instagram, and then they get hurt, and they're not quite the same. And that's something you've got to be careful with. And I think that's one thing I would like to do a post on some days. Well, my last post was kind of about this, but pacing progression, stuff like that. And that's gonna be something you're gonna want to take into account. But kind of segueing back, a lot of the high level lifters, they're gonna have streaks of bad training. You're just not seeing it because you're gonna just see the highlights and stuff. So we see a lot of these younger lifters, they get frustrated when things don't go well. And that's part of the game. Like I've told people, that's literally just part of the
Yeah.
sport. If you're getting better meet to meet, you're improving your
Yeah.
total, you're probably moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Something I would like to see more, and like obviously I think the biggest constraint to this is financial. It's not something that people opt out of just for the sake of opting out of it. I definitely would like to see increased exposure for people to work with some sports psychologist in powerlifting. I think some of the higher level people do in some capacity. But like people like, I don't know if you are familiar with Amelia Potts, or like Potts Thinks, I think is her Instagram handle. But
Uh-uh.
she like makes a lot of, they're pretty short generally, but just little posts about like framing, training, framing your progression, things along those lines. And not all of it is specifically like powerlifting related or like sport related. But she is a really good person. I feel like obviously people could work with her, but I just think in terms of like you have all this social media exposure of people hitting their big lifts and doing all these crazy things. And probably the majority of lifters out there, especially younger lifters, aren't really looking at the other side of things and like following a couple of sports psychologists, a couple of nutritionists, a couple of people, physical therapists, aren't working with a broader scope of people who are going to provide more insight into what it means to be an athlete as a whole. Because what it means to be an athlete isn't making constant progress all the time, right? Like and that goes for every sport out there. Like, I don't know if you're in a fantasy league right now or anything like that, but like it's very clear people have very upset reactions to, their team is not doing great one week. Maybe they were doing amazing last week and won, and then now half their team's doing terrible, not scoring any points in their league. But like that is a part of what it is to be an athlete, is to expect the ups and downs that are going to occur and just putting your best foot forward and continuing on.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think the number one limiter on careers is going to be burnout and injury. Those two things. So if you can stay healthy and string together some healthy training as well as just not getting burned out. We've seen this year it almost feels like an epidemic of burnouts. Like we've just seen so many people leave the sport. I don't know if you've ran into that as much. I've definitely had some clients, but I know some of the East Coast guys, they've had some guys leave their roster and stuff just because of burnout.
Yeah.
And it's become a topic talked about on Instagram, and like avoiding burnout. I know Andrew made a post on it. Matt Cronin touched on it on a Powerlifting Now video, I believe this last month, or the month before. But burnout's been
Yeah.
something we've seen. And I think Steve has said this, where the average lifespan of a powerlifter is only like 2 meets. Like that's just the
Yeah,
most fit in
I
one
think
or two.
it's like 2 to 3. Yeah, two to
Yeah.
three. I think is like the average, and whether that's meets or years of doing it, either way, it's a very short
Hmm.
lifespan for the majority of people. And obviously, I'd like to see that extend, but I think we see that shortened thing one because doing it recreationally and trying to make constant progress requires a lot, and that's where I think we see a lot of people get burnt out when they are trying to do it, whether it be at a competitive or recreational level, but they're very driven by progress, of course. and when they can't put their life factors the way that they need in order to drive progress, as that would be their biggest limiting factor, excluding obviously like just if they have amazing variables but their training is stagnating. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about other side of the coin. People who their life, they just can't dedicate anything more to the training. I feel like those people are seeing a high degree of burnout. I mean, I think this is pretty unanimous amongst everyone that I've talked to in some capacity. Like, I think the highest rate of burnout that I see for sure is like people, between like 18 and 24 that are in college or schooling of some kind. And, when they're in their freshman, sophomore, junior year, things go pretty smooth. They're able to balance their gym life quite a bit better. Nutritionally may not be the best, sleep may not be the best because of school and studying and stuff like that. But like they're getting the training sessions and things along those lines. And then once they start transitioning, like senior year, moving out into the real world, having to get a job and stuff like that, I feel like those people I tend to see the biggest amount of burnout where they're like, hey, like I enjoy powerlifting, I enjoy coaching and all this stuff, but like I just can't dedicate my time and attention to it right now. Like it's not really what I'm focused on and things along those lines. And obviously, there's a whole plethora of reasons for people to burn out, but I feel like that's definitely one of the biggest demographics I've seen and one of the biggest reasons why I've seen people leave.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that like it makes sense. Most people are going to come in the sport. Most people are hobbyists and most people only do local meets. So it makes sense that okay, people do 2, 3, 4 meets, then they're done. They compete for 3 years in college or, but people do have lives outside of training. So that's something to expect. But I just feel like this year's been very high degree of that. And again, I think we can pin some of that to the federations kind of breaking up and moving around. But
Definitely. I talked about it a little bit in a conversation that in the group chat that we have with Alex, but just talking about like definitely this year is a big year, and I think that is for a lot of reasons like federation stuff. Um, and then along those lines, obviously, like we talked about, a lot of people are kind of stretched for money and time right now. And I think that a lot of people, I think the expression I used when we were talking is like a lot of people feel like the weight of the world on their shoulders right now. And while obviously for some people who I don't want to say that they're like more committed to the craft, but for lack of better words, that's what I'll say, people who are like all in on powerlifting. Obviously those factors either aren't affecting them as much or they're willing to work with those factors to continue their career as a powerlifter. But I do think that that paired with some of the other things we talked about certainly makes it feel like this year has been pretty exceptional for seeing people experience burnout or not being able to commit the time and effort that they want to towards it.
yeah. Yeah. And I think like all things, we're going to see this kind of swing back. I wouldn't be surprised if in the next year or two, things, obviously we're still seeing the sport growing. Someone told me this. I don't have any data to back this up. Someone told me this yesterday. Or it was 2 weeks ago. It's probably 2 weeks ago that the sport has more people in it now than it did like 2 years ago. I'm not sure if that's
Sure.
true, but I would be willing to bet it probably is. So
I would
we're still
assume.
seeing growth, but it just feels like a weird year. And again, I think it's because of the climate within the sport with the federations, which I want to touch on that at the end. So we'll swing back to that. Did you have anything else you kind of wanted to touch on with, I guess, the social media aspect and that affecting kind of newer lifters?
I feel good. I feel like we talked about that pretty well.
Okay, so next up, let's go into, so let's say someone's a new lifter, they're listening. Couple things here. So they're trying to decide, let's say they see Russ hit the 740-pound squat on Instagram, and they're like, wow, I want to do that, right? We see a lot of people do that. So they want to come into the sport. They start, maybe they're lifting weights, maybe they're not, but they start to lift some weights. They start powerlifting. They start focusing on SBD specifically. They're deciding, do I want to get a coach? They're looking around for maybe a first coach, self-coaching. We've seen some people maybe I've seen a lot of people who I know should probably get coaches. They're a little stubborn. But I also see the opposite of the coin. Some people just jump and get a coach right away. And I feel like sometimes that's not the best thing to do. What is your opinions on that with coach versus self-coach? Because for myself,
So I think that so I see both ends of the spectrum, and I'll tell you about myself. So like when I first got into powerlifting, I'd been lifting recreationally for a few years at that point. So like I wasn't necessarily like, oh, the most proficient person at squat, bench, and deadlift in the world, but like I was squatting in the high 300s, I was deadlifting around 400, and I was bench pressing in like the mid 200s. So like, and you know, when I started out, I was in the 90 class, and yeah, I was just like in college lifting, having fun, and I got into it. Um, and yeah, so like I got into it, and when I decided that I was going to do it, I just did a more um powerlifting focused split, I guess you would say. I didn't buy like a premium program or anything like that. I pretty heavily had been using like Jeff Nippard programs and in following his training style pretty specifically, because you know he was definitely, I was following more of his bodybuilding kind of focused stuff, his hypertrophy focused stuff. But he has some strength focused stuff as well. So I was using some things that I had learned from that and following his channel. And then I was at that point an exercise science student anyways. So I just figured like I would write my own training and stuff like that. Um, and so that's how I got into my first meet. And like I just looked at videos, I just read things on the rules. Like I missed my third squat on missing the rack command, and I missed my first deadlift on shoulder lockout. So like I was by no means like the most proficient person in the world, but like I put forth the effort ahead of time and like knew enough about lifting in general to put together something for me that made sense with what I did now. And like I performed well, and I was happy with it. And obviously I got hooked and am where I am now. But all that to say, like I think that people can totally start out, and it's probably better to start out. In whether or not this is talking about going and doing a meet or just talking about getting into like more strength focused SBD powerlifting style training, I think it makes sense for people who have no foundation, like they weren't really training beforehand, maybe just like jogging and hitting arms, you know, like that kind of person at the gym. They would probably benefit from just like buying a templated program online or something like that from someone, or just like finding a coach who just writes off programs into actual coaching, and just getting a starting foundation on things, and you know, trying to get a little bit jacked, a little bit strong before fully dedicating themselves into like, I'm going to do a meet and really focus on that. I think it can depend on the person when it comes to that next step of like, oh, you want to find a meet and sign up and like get into the sport. I think some people, like I said, my experience was like I've been lifting for a few years at that point, like pretty into it. And like I had, again, enough of an interest, enough of a background. I was studying lifting in school. I was watching all sorts of YouTube videos of different people talking about, you know, the science of lifting and whatnot. And so I felt like I had a pretty good grasp. And so for two meets, my first two meets, I was self-coached and just like wrote my own programming. I did like a template program or two, but that was pretty much just what I did. And then for my third meet is when I got a coach. And then that's when I started handing it off to someone more directly. So not to necessarily say like people should do exactly what I did. And I'm not saying that I was the smartest guy in the world or anything like that for how I programmed myself or anything, but I think people who have more experience could probably get further doing self-coaching. But it reached a point where I could tell I was just like getting too neurotic with my training. I was changing things every 2 or 3 weeks versus just seeing things through longevity wise, because I wasn't making the progress I wanted to make. I definitely think younger lifters who are way more just like wanting to hit certain numbers and stuff like that, and they'll do anything to get there. Those people probably need a little bit more direction, as opposed to someone who's a little bit more level-headed approach towards their training and willing to make progress at the rate that like they make it, you know, whether or not that means that they're doing everything right or everything wrong. Someone who is going to, like I said, going to be a bit more level-headed and wanting to take a slower, more gradual approach to things can probably benefit from just like going and buying a program online or something like that and using that. And then after they, you know, maybe get a meet under their belt, going and working with the coach. But there's nothing wrong with starting out, you know, you lift whatever for a few months and you decide you want to do a powerlifting meet and then you hire a coach. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that a lot of people, you know, as with most things, your newbie gains when you get into lifting in any capacity. You can make a lot of progress in a short period of time starting out, especially I feel like getting into powerlifting. And so most people probably don't need like a super hyper specific plan of people, figuring out their exact frequency, their exact exposure timing, things like that. For someone who's just starting out lifting, probably doesn't need to have someone who's super, super worried about that in their corner. But at the same time, if you are working with someone who has that knowledge and background where they can kind of look at your training and being like, you're starting out, you're new, you're going to be getting newbie games. So we can really just take advantage of this time and try to build a lot of foundation. And then down the road, we'll have more knowledge of how to build around everything. If you're in it for the long game, like I was doing my first 2 meets myself, and I knew that I wanted to continue doing this, and I felt like in order to continue doing this and progressing at the rate that I wanted, I needed someone else in my corner to hold me accountable and keep me um, on the right path with what I need to do to progress. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if that really answers your question of like starting out, what should people do, what shouldn't they do? But I do think that it really depends on the background and where you plan to go in the sport. If you're just doing one for fun and like you don't really have a lot of intention into sticking around, you just want to try it out, that definitely I would say is probably not worth, finding a coach, reaching out to them and then being like, hey, in 3 months, I'm going to drop you and just do my own thing again. But I want to have someone prep me for this. Obviously, if there's an established, agreed upon relationship ahead of time, then that's different. Um, but there's also people who will just hire someone and then fire them as soon as the meet's done, which isn't really, I would say, the approach you should take if you're going to be hiring coaches for doing this. Because, like I said, I think you're going to get the most out of the coach the longer you work with them, assuming they're a good coach, of course. Um, but and then for someone who they're getting into their first meet and they plan to, whatever, they have a pretty good total. They're like 50 kilos off of qualifying total for nationals or something like that. They maybe do their first meet on their own and they're like, okay, I need someone else to help me. Then like, definitely hire a coach so that you can get to that long-term goal of getting to nationals or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think you can't go wrong if you're new. You can't go wrong either way. And I think if you're someone who, like you said, you have plans to be in the sport for a while, or you've already been in the sport for a while, like you should probably get a coach. Having some direction is going to help. For most people, even we see established coaches like they don't self-coach. Very few of them self-coach. I tried it for a long time. I enjoyed doing it, but it's much better just to have someone in your corner. And I'm obviously working with Devin now and have been for a while, and that's been great because he's gonna basically provide the direction without making me think about it. And as we see, Alex actually just captioned one of his most recent training posts about self-coaching. But most coaches are gonna, if you're self-coaching yourself, you're probably gonna push yourself to an extent that maybe you shouldn't, or you're not gonna, your biases are gonna start kicking in with yourself a little more. But I think if someone's new, they're coming in the sport. I think you have two ways to look at it. If you're doing your first meet, you're just looking to have some fun. I think you running the templated approach works really well. And I'll give you an example. One of my clients, Segan, he did his first meet. He inquired with me maybe like 4 weeks before this meet, and it was like agreed upon. Okay, once the meet's over, we'll start on program and we'll start working together. But he was running Jeff Nippert's program, and I think the benefit to that was he got some experience, um, low pressure experience. There wasn't like any pressure to, you know, um, commit to certain things throughout prep or whatever. And he was able to kind of probably learn quite a bit about his body and stuff because he doesn't have anyone to really tell him what's happening or what's going on. He's got to figure a lot of it out, figuring out the commands, figuring out, meet day nutrition. Like you have to put the legwork in to figure some of that out. Versus with a coach, you can kind of have some of that information handed to you, which again is not a bad thing. But I think from there, since he's kind of come over and started working with me, it's been very easy because he has that baseline. And now it was like, okay, we're just going to take everything in the training and we're just going to organize it in a manner that's better. And it's been great. But I think the opposite can be true as well, where if you kind of are coming in the sport and if you financially have the money to, it doesn't hurt to get a coach and work with the coaches, especially if you feel like, I think you made a good point. If you feel like you're going to be around for a while or you want to work with this individual for longer than 3-4 months, I think it's a worthwhile investment for someone because it is going to provide that direction. And I think you touch on the neuroticism point really well, where the more neurotic you are, probably the more likely you want to get a coach earlier, or else you are just going to spin your wheels. You're going to change things up, and you're never going to catch momentum.
Yeah, that's how I found myself being when I like again first meet, like just was doing it, feeling it out, seeing if it was for me. It sounded fun. I wanted to try it. Second, like, and then I got the bug. I did my first meet. I was interested in doing another one. So like then I think I did run a templated program into my next meet, and did good progress, had fun, and then I signed up for another one at the end of the year because that second one that I had was I think in April-ish time. And I signed up for another one at the end of the year that I was planning on doing. And then like August, I ended up getting a coach because, like I said, just like was spinning my wheels, just like changing things. I would have a bench session that went bad, and then I would go to my programming, just like rewrite my bench session, and
Mhm.
and just keep changing things constantly. And while I think that can, it can work for some people, there's some people who have a good discernment of, hey, this isn't working, like I need to change it, and they can find that soon, and they can discern between it being neuroticism versus it like not working. That can certainly exist, but like I said, I'd been probably trying to do powerlifting for less than a year at that point. So it's not even like I really had a solid baseline understanding of what works and doesn't work, because I went from self-programming for a first meet and then like different template programming and then back to my own programming. And most of it is, not under the guidance of anyone who's really tracking my progress other than myself. And as I'm sure you know from self-coaching yourself, it's really easy to just look at your numbers and have that be your guiding instead of actually looking at like what you're doing on the program. You just look at like, what did I hit now? What did I hit 6 months ago? It hasn't improved. I need to change everything. And
Mhm.
that's kind of the mindset that you get into with stuff. So, um, yeah, I don't know. I think that for the most part, everyone can benefit from having someone in their corner who is able to guide that. Like I said, assuming you got a good coach, you have a good relationship, they understand your training. Like, it's always stands to be beneficial to have someone like that to guide you and talk to you through stuff and all of that. But I definitely think there's a certain group of people who can totally forego that for a meet or two, whatever, and make good progress, and do their own thing. And then I said also there's a small group of people who I think like can really pick out their stuff well. Like, they don't need a coach. They probably have a good understanding of their body. And have, this especially I feel like applies to people who maybe aren't true novices, like they've been in the gym for 5 years but never focused on squat, bench, or deadlift or something like that. Like, those
Yeah.
people probably have a pretty good understanding. If you have a guy who's never like really focused on bench press, but he's able to do, 8 reps at 225, like that guy can probably pretty well figure out in the first, little bit of time how to improve his bench press, because he's probably somewhat experienced if he's able to throw in 225 like that.
Mhm.
Um, but again, that guy would also still probably stand to benefit from hiring a coach who could take him from doing 225 for 8 to 265 for 8 or something like that in a relatively short period of time, because that guy's also probably pretty hardworking and focused and would do well with a coach.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I shouldn't say this is common, but I feel like maybe some people don't get into competing because they don't have a coach, or they feel like it's a barrier of entry. And I don't think that should be a barrier of entry to compete. You can sign up for a meet next weekend, assuming registration's still open, and just show up and lift. There's nothing
Yeah.
holding you back from doing a meet. And we'll touch on this next about, when to do your first meet and how often, but having a coach should not be a barrier of entry. You can figure a lot of it out yourself, to at least get your feet wet with competing and being a power lifter. But obviously, I think having the objective set of eyes on your training, someone who's going to be less emotional about your training is going to be more objective, be able to make good troubleshooting and problem solving decisions, about, yourself, training technique, or programming technique, is going to be helpful for, I would say, 95% of lifters should probably have
Yeah.
a coach. I mean, the
And I
the
think, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
the few that don't, um or that do well self-coach, they're one, they're coaches themselves, and then two, they're just, you know not neurotic. They're very level-headed. And I think one thing we see a lot in powerlifting is a lot of neuroticism. So yeah,
Yeah.
I just don't think it should be a
And
barrier of entry for people. That's all.
totally. And I would even go on to say that, like, I think the people who are going to benefit the most from just starting out and either doing their own thing, template program, writing their own program, whatever, the people who are always going to do the best are the people who do that in combination with learning stuff at the same time. Like, a guy who writes his own programming but doesn't learn the rules of a meet is obviously not going to have the best day of his life competing because he'll probably jump his commands or not wait for a down command on deadlift, just drop the ball, whatever. Stuff like that is going to happen for someone who has zero interest in learning about certain things of the sport, but maybe they're just focused on their training itself and worried about getting their numbers up. People who, like I said, like not that I'm the star example, but someone like me who for my first meet, I had somewhat of an understanding of training. Like I've been doing it for a while. I was interested in exercise science, so I was interested in writing my own program. And I was watching people online, and I would watch videos of powerlifters talk about how they trained and watch the rules of the meet and read the rule book and stuff like that. The people who do those sort of things are super better suited, in my opinion, to start out taking things into their own hands.
Yeah. Yeah, you make a really good point actually, where we see people where they maybe come from a more gym bro like background. I don't want that to sound like a negative term, but they come from like this a bodybuilding side. They're like, yeah, I want to do a meet like this. This is cool. I'm pretty strong. They're going in, they're hitting heavy lifts every week and whatever. And then meet day comes and then they just get floored because they're not pausing their benches, they're not squatting to depth, they're not locking out their deadlifts. They're not used to like lifting at the pace that you're expected to in the meet in terms of you're at the judge's mercy with bench press. Like you're not going at your pace. You're waiting for the start command, you're waiting for the press command, waiting for the rack command. I think a lot of those people can benefit from a coach where yes, you're strong, but like you're not trained to the standard in training. And I think having someone guide you to that standard and kind of get you there is going to be the best thing.
Most definitely.
People. So I see that a lot. I see a lot of people. Again, we've all been there. If you're a coach or even a lifter, you've been at meets before. It's like, man, that guy's strong, but man, they could really use a coach. Like they would have a much better day if they just had someone in their corner. So, yeah, I think you can go both ways when you're starting out. If you're brand new, you're thinking about doing a meet in 4 months or whatever. You can jump on a templated program. There's a lot of great ones online.
Yeah.
Or you can get a coach. And I don't think you can go wrong either way. But I think the deeper you get in the sport or the more long-term focus you have with the sport, that's when you're going to start seeing more people kind of inquiring with a coach. So
Definitely. If you are a person who is willing to do your own research on the rules and making sure that, filming your lifts or having someone watch your lifts, make sure that you're doing things, get commands from people in the gym. If you're the kind of person who's willing to take that initiative and hold yourself accountable to the standard that you're going to be held to at the meet, I like we both said, I think you're definitely a better suited individual. But again, also like we both said, you probably never stand to be losing out on something by having the coach as well, in your
yeah,
corner. And like I also have said a few times, assuming your coach is good, there's bad coaches out there who are not going to be that helpful to you in regards to those things. But assuming that you have a coach who's good, you probably only stand to benefit whether you're a person who really takes that upon yourself to learn about everything, or you want someone else to explain it all to you. You probably don't stand to lose anything by having a coach in your corner. But if you definitely fall on the side of things where, kind of like you said, it's not a bad thing, but if you're more of just like gym bro lifter who just like goes in and wants to lift heavy and hard and push everything to failure or close every session, that person might be a little bit more suited to needing someone in their corner to guide them kind of out of that sort of training and approaching it more in an athletic capacity.
yeah, yeah, I agree. Um, Next up, we'll segue kind of into when should someone kind of, and we kind of talked on it a little bit, but when should someone do their first meet and how often do you think beginners and we can get into lifters in general, but how often do you think beginners should do um like their first competition or I guess how often should they compete in their first year or two?
So I would say I don't really have a lot to say on this. My stance on it is pretty can be summed up pretty quickly. I think that like when should someone compete? Whenever you are like ready and want to is like a fine explanation for it. Like obviously, um, as we know as coaches who have lifters, like you're going to want to give yourself long enough to prepare for it. Like you said, if you could technically sign up for one super short term if there's space on the roster, but that's obviously not going to be the most conducive to doing the best that you
Yeah.
can, which I would assume is the goal of someone who wants to compete. And so if you see a meet that's whatever 11 weeks away, and you just want to do it, and you're going to be, like I said, the kind of person who either is going to hire a coach or is going to like look into it and transition your training towards that, towards making sure that you're doing everything to standard. Like in that instance, do it when you want to. Give yourself enough time to prepare for it, but do it whenever you want to. In terms of people once they're in, how frequently should they compete? I think newer lifters should probably compete more, would be my opinion, than someone who's been in it for a while. Now, that doesn't mean 6 times a year necessarily. I would say I think that newer lifters probably getting into it, having more exposure to different kinds of meets, different people, different referees, stuff like that kind of builds your perspective of what it means to like be a power lifter and compete and stuff like
Mhm.
that. And that, if you do your first meet in 2021 and you don't do your next meet until 2023, obviously there can be a lot of times there to build and grow as a lifter. But I think that, at least in my opinion, buy into the sport, engagement in the sport tends to be pretty dependent on people who, in their first year and a half of powerlifting, compete multiple times. And then I think that as years go on, maybe you competed for the first time 2021, you did 2 meets that year, you did 2 meets in 2022. So you have like 4-ish meets under your belt competing twice a year. Then that person could probably, if they want to, like transition down to like 1 to 2 times a year, give longer spaces to make more progress since they're not going to be adapting at quite the same rate that they were starting out. But I think it's highly individual to like how much do you enjoy competing, and also what level of competitor are you as well. Like if you're like a national level competitor, you might be seeking out opportunities at money meets or like trying to get pro card in USAPL, stuff like that. So you might be competing 3 to 4 times a year for the sake of something like that, in which case more power to you. But I'm talking about more of the kind of, maybe state or regional level lifter, maybe someone who's not quite at that level of prestige where there's monetary or status value for competing more frequently. That person probably should be reserving competition for when they can devote the most to their training and get the most out of competing. And that would be my opinion. I mean, people are going to have different opinions about how much or when you should compete, when you shouldn't compete, stuff like that. But I feel like from what I've seen, that's been the people who compete more earlier in their career and then kind of make room for powerlifting to exist well in their lives as they get a little bit more advanced. I feel like they tend to enjoy powerlifting more and be able to maintain a bit more longevity in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree. You want to give yourself, if someone's coming in their first meet, you want to give yourself that opportunity to kind of prep for it and really get prepared for it. But it doesn't need to be a long time. It's not like you have to be like, oh, I'll do a meet next year. And, I think you said 11 weeks, 12 weeks, somewhere in that 8 to 16 week mark, like it's probably a good time to really start looking at signing up if you're looking at doing a meet. In terms of like strength levels, I hear a lot of people where they're like, well, I'm not, I'd be embarrassed with my numbers, or I'm not strong enough, or I'm not a strong person. It doesn't matter. Like
Yeah, it doesn't matter at all.
I've never been to a powerlifting meet ever and felt like the vibe there and like the culture at the meet was not inclusive to everybody. I've never been
I
to a meet
totally
where
agree.
anyone ever not been very just respectful and nice, and like meets have a great atmosphere in my opinion. So if that's a concern of yours, I don't I would reconsider that, just because I don't think it's just not something you're gonna see. No, you're
Yeah,
not gonna
it's
go to
why I don't
make fun
I
of
didn't
you.
even mention it, is because I have so many people similar to you, I'm sure, who talk about like, oh, I need to hit this before I compete. Like I need
Yeah.
to be able to hit I need to be able to hit 100 kilos on bench. I need to be able to squat more than my body weight. I mean, whatever arbitrary number that they have in their head. Unless you can't lift the bar, that's like the only barrier to entry numbers
Uh-huh.
wise for what you need to do to be able to compete. So I'm totally same page. Like I said, that's why I didn't even mention it, is because when people talk to me about that, I just kind of write it off as like, you don't really know what you're talking. Like you're talking about someone, you're talking about something who, it doesn't matter. Like no one at the meet cares. And like if it's not an actual barrier to entry, then like you're just making it up, which is fine. Like if someone's like, oh, when I do a meet for the first time, it's because I want to be able to hit 225 to comp standard, and then no one can ever take it away from me that I did 225. It's official, whatever. Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Like that's fine if that is your like position and like milestone that you're going for. But truthfully, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I think if you want to compete someday, or it's something you're interested in, like the earlier the better, just get into a meet. In terms of like frequency of that, I agree. I think the earlier you are, the more often you can compete. Um, Myself, though, I was an example. I did like a meet and then I didn't compete until a year later. But I don't think it hurt me just because I was starting to do the self-coaching thing and was figuring a lot of stuff out on my own. Where like my second meet, I was self-coached, went 9 for 9, you know, peaked really well. Like
Yeah, that
I
was the
was almost like
same
a
for me
veteran
as
coming
well.
in, you know what
Yeah.
I mean? So, but some people aren't gonna be like that. I had a client, we did his first meet in early 2022, like February 2022. And then just with school and life and stuff, he wasn't able to do another meet until this past summer. So like July of 24. So we have like a year and a half or whatever that is, with no meet. It almost felt like we were doing his second, or I guess it almost felt like a second first meet experience for him. It's because it was such
Sure.
a long time off. So, um, yeah, I think like the newer you are, you're gonna compete as often as you'd like. I don't think there's a downside to competing 4 times a year or whatever. As long as you set the expectation that hey, maybe competing 4 times a year, maybe one of the lifts isn't gonna necessarily, have this
Yeah.
huge meet PR or whatever, at one of those meets. But for the most part, I don't think there's a downside to competing a lot. I think as you become more advanced, or if you get outside of the local level, you start to become very competitive or whatever. If that's the trajectory you're on, you're kind of competing when you need to, or when it makes sense. Like you said, money meets. You're gonna have to do meets for qualifying totals. To qualify for nationals or whatever. And you're gonna want to do meets to kind of continue to build um, I guess data with your coach or whatever. Like I've had people
Sure,
where,
data, momentum, and
yeah,
like strategy. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I've had people where it's like, yeah, well, we need to do another meet, even if from a qualifying standpoint, you don't need it. Like we should squeeze another one in just to get more data, kind of moving into this meet, more info about, a weight cut process for you, more info about a taper process, because there's only a few times a year you can really practice that and work on that. And every time you're really putting your best foot forward with an educated guess. So I think if you're a local level lifter and you don't care about being competitive, or if you're not competitive but you've been around for a while, I think it's one of those things where, um, again, similar to a beginner, compete as often as you'd like. I think 1 to 2 times a year is a good spot for a lot of like your kind of intermediate level local lifters. Someone like myself, I compete. I've competed once a year, pretty much every single year I've competed. This year I'll be doing a meet twice, and then so I'll hopefully kind of get onto the 2 times a year. Um, Pace. We'll see how many years that lasts for, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's just going to depend. Compete as often as you'd like. I don't think it hurts to do one meet a year if you are kind of a bit of a veteran. You've been around for a little bit. I think one meet a year is a good number too, or less. I mean, again, compete as often as you'd like. Um, but I think the newer you are, the more hours you're gonna want to get on the platform, the more time you're gonna want to spend competing, just because it's just more practice and stuff. Like you said, exposure to new people, exposure to different refs, potentially different federations and stuff like that. So, it's
Yeah.
just more experience. So, um, I guess lastly, we'll touch on federations quick. And the landscape's a little different depending on where you're at in the US, or just across the world internationally too. But for people who want to compete drug tested, um, you kind of have two options. You have PA, USAPL. There's some drug tested federations like the USPA's has some drug tested stuff, I think.
Yeah, USPA and WRPF,
Okay.
PLU now, Powerlifting United.
Yeah.
Um, like they have drug tested sides, and I would say someone who like wants to get in to powerlifting, it doesn't really matter where you start out. The
Mm.
only thing I would probably discourage someone from doing is starting out in Powerlifting America, just because it's, you if you start in Powerlifting America and then you want to go somewhere else, you'll have to serve that Powerlifting America suspension, which for most people isn't going to be a big deal, but it's just something you have to deal with.
Hmm.
And so I would say it's probably the least novice friendly, in terms of getting into it, for that sole reason alone. But I think as a drug tested competitor, anywhere starting out can be good. If you're wanting to get to the higher competitive level, you're probably going to be looking more at that Powerlifting America, USAPL, pathway through their meets. Not that Powerlifting United, WRPF, USPA, they don't have semi-competitive, places, but most of their competitors at the highest level that they're offering is going to be non-tested division work. Um, but I think, I don't know. I think that you can't really go wrong starting anywhere for the most part. I do think I would consider USPA, Powerlifting United, WRPF as a beginner powerlifter to be like, those are probably the most like newbie friendly meet, just because not to discredit them for having these things, but 24-hour weigh-in, the bars are going to slightly benefit people depending on how you train, right? If you never train on a deadlift bar, it's probably not going to be that helpful, but you stand to have equipment that could potentially benefit you more, potentially have monolift. You don't have to worry about, your feet, how they're set on the ground. There's a lot of things that come with them, those federations, that I would say are like a bit more novice friendly because the rules just aren't quite as rigid as USAPL and Powerlifting America. But I would also say that, obviously USAPL, Powerlifting America could have very solid local level meets that lifters can get into for the first time. It's not in my interest to try to dissuade people from doing that. But I definitely feel like, depending on how competitive as a drug tested lifter you want to be, will pretty much dictate what road you want to go down. But again, kind of like you said, it also just depends on what you have around you, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say if you're a new powerlifter, don't worry about federation. Just look at where are their meets. If there's a WRPF meet that lines up with your schedule that you want to do that. Like, it doesn't hurt to just do that. Even if you have plans to kind of move into the USAPL side of things or the PA side of things or that kind of tested power bar side of things, it doesn't hurt to start in a different federation. I would compete where there's opportunity to. And I think Eric made a good story on this the other day. But he said, at least, with kind of the framework of how powerlifting's set up right now with all the federations and stuff, support meet directors and not necessarily federations.
Definitely,
You know,
definitely.
I think if there's good meet directors in your area, and regardless of their federation, like if they put on good powerlifting meets, and like, the caveat is you're not trying to go to USAPL nationals, or you're not trying to go to worlds or PA nationals or whatever, do their meets, right? They're still
Yeah,
powerlifting meets. The rules are very similar across federations. The biggest ones is PA and USAPL. They're going to run the same bars, same equipment. Bench depth's pretty much the only one. Head can come off the bench on USAPL, but other than that, that's pretty much it. And then
yeah. And I think and also a big thing to kind of tie into that is, while obviously supporting your meet directors is important and you should go to whatever meet directors you want to support. Additionally, this can exist within just gyms as well, to say a bit broader than meet director, because like, again, I'll go back to the Fight or Quit, which is in Vegas. I have a client, Aaron, and another guy, Sebastian, and they both train at Fight or Quit pretty frequently. And Fight or Quit is like, you'll see clips of their meets online. They've got the smoke and walkout songs and all the crazy stuff going on, right? But that happens whether it's USAPL, Powerlifting America, Powerlifting United, WRP. They're doing that level of competition, prestige, promotional value, depending on where. So like, people fly to their meets all the time and do their stuff because of the prestige, regardless of the federation that it's in. So not just not just meet directors. Who do you want to support in federation? But also just certain gyms are going to go out of their way to put on several different federation sort of meets to cater to all sorts of people. And I think that that's definitely one of the cooler things you can also focus on supporting is meet directors and the venues or the people running those meets. If they're putting together a consistent level of meet, regardless of federation, like, that's where I would always be looking to compete. Like, if I
yeah,
lived there, I would be like, I don't really care what federation I'm doing. I'm just doing my meets where they're holding the best meets and there's the best community to do that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you could even go down the unsanctioned route. There's my gym, Omaha Barbell. The gym owner, he holds two meets a year, I believe, both unsanctioned. One of them is the Ed Cone Classic. Ed Cone shows up and is your head judge, which is kind of cool. And then the other one's like the Omaha Open. And I don't think that's a bad idea either. You're gonna go there, you're gonna, have an atmosphere of people from the Omaha
Yeah.
area or just at the gym. You're gonna know everyone. Um, if you train at that gym, and then, they are going to typically be a little lenient on some of the rules here and there and stuff. And I don't think that's a bad thing. If you're new, I don't think that's a bad thing. A lot of times commercial gyms will hold meets. I know like YMCA's will hold meets. I don't think that's a
Yeah,
bad idea to go to one of those either.
so I've helped for the last year. There's a university, Western Washington University, and so they have a powerlifting club there, and people who compete collegiate and stuff like that. But every year they hold a meet in either late November, early December, and they do like a student run powerlifting meet. And so like that's just, they're on a whiteboard writing down attempts, warming up in the rec room, and then going into the gym where they have a power rack set up and pound plates, and
Mhm.
just an unsanctioned meet. And they get, so like last year I did refereeing, and they had two other people who compete in powerlifting as their referees and running the table and stuff. So like all the people who compete and are a part of the club doing that stuff, they're running the meet, and then they have students coming in and doing the meet, and like dipping their toe in the first way as well. And I think that that's great because I don't know what the cost is. I think it was like $20-ish for them to get in and do it the first time. And obviously it's like a student fundraiser, student run sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I think really anywhere as a first timer, just dipping your toe in and seeing if it's for you. It doesn't really matter. Like you said, support the people who are running it and supporting like the gyms and all that stuff. That
Yeah.
should be for the first meet. What matters, like what's around you, what makes sense for you to do, who do you want to be around when you compete for the first time?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. One of the I think it was like the second or third meet I ever really like coached at, like handled at was a meet at UNO, University of Nebraska Omaha. It was a student run meet. They call it the MAV Liftoff, I think, and they just hold that every year. Where like it's very primitive in terms of like attempt selections where like I think I changed like his like third squat. Like they let me do that. You know what I mean? Just things like that. Like,
Yeah.
they're very the rules are very wishy-washy, which I don't think is a bad thing. I don't think that hurts at all. Um,
I
and
mean, if that's what you're doing with an unsanctioned meet, is that's what you're allowing for,
yeah,
really. I mean,
yeah,
obviously, the goal is to not have like whatever goes sort of
yeah.
meet, right? But that sort of flexibility that you give with people for being unsanctioned, um, lower cost to entry, stuff like that. I agree with you. I think that's totally beneficial for someone getting into it for the first time. Now, obviously, if anyone who's listening to this is doing something like that, just know that whatever your unsanctioned meets calls are probably iffy compared to an actual federation, like what they call on depth and pauses and stuff
Hmm.
like that. Is you're probably going to see a raise in the standards no matter where you went. If you did an unsanctioned meet, no matter what federation you go to, it's probably going to be an elevated standard.
Hmm.
But like we were both saying, that's not necessarily the bad thing. It beats, just going with your buddy to the gym and having him judge your depth from the back as he
Yeah.
spots you on squat. Like,
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And even segueing back to like the meets held at my gym, the unsanctioned meets, the production value is really good. Like I would argue it's some of the best in the state. I mean, lights off, you've got an announcer, um, just they do a lot for the lifters. They give a lot of it back to the lifters where like, what I don't know what the entry fee is, whatever that is, then you're getting a free t-shirt, you're getting free supplements. There's a supplement company that sponsors it, things like that. So again, you're supporting small local businesses and you're supporting meet directors and gyms. So just compete where it's convenient to. Obviously if your goal is to like a lot of my goals kind of I guess longer term goals would maybe align with the USAPL where if you're someone who, hey, my goal is to hit a USAPL QT and go to nationals, like you've got to compete USAPL. But if that's not your goal, then you can compete wherever you want. There's no rules with that. So
yeah. And like definitely, I mean, most people getting into it, I mean, I'm not, people can get into it on their own without anyone, but most people I would say like they have a buddy doing it or whatever like that. And I definitely think the best experiences that I've ever had at a meet were when I was doing them with people that I knew and liked. And so, maybe like for me in my first meet, I didn't um, know anyone because I traveled again like 5-6 hours down to my first place that I was doing a meet. I didn't know the venue, I didn't know anyone there. But me and my roommate Cal, we decided to do it together, and we're lifting buddies and everything. We just decided to sign up and do it together, and like that made for a super positive experience. And obviously, you meet people at meets, and you talk to people, you make new friends, you meet your meet buddies who you see at other meets and stuff, and it's a cool thing that you can develop. But I definitely think if you have a buddy who's like, hey, you should get into this, like I'm doing this meet, like you should sign up and do it with me. Like if you're kind of wishy-washy on the fence, there's in my opinion no better way to get into it than by having someone else to do it with. Like I think that's super fun. And again, like if you guys are training together towards the meet, you guys can like talk about stuff, or if you somehow didn't learn that there's a down command on deadlift, maybe your buddy did, and you
Mhm.
guys talk about that, going into the meet or whatever. So I definitely think that is also like, not that it's unspoken, but definitely one of the best ways to get into meets is either with like a friend or a colleague or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you bring up a good point where um a lot of powerlifting is meeting new friends and stuff. A lot of my friends I've made since, I've been an adult are most of them are powerlifters. And like I'm very grateful for the community for that reason. But like again, competing locally is gonna be a really good option to meet people, meet friends. And Instagram's like, a way that we kind of follow each other and connect in there for, longer term portions as well. So yeah, I think did you have anything else you wanted to add with that?
Now compete where you want. If you compete in WRPF, you might be Powerlifting United now. In case you didn't know, they might have switched you over.
Yeah.
Um,
If you're doing nationals, you're definitely Powerlifting United now.
yeah, I mean that whole thing is interesting. I mean, it seems like it all happened for good reason. So, at first I was upset. I don't know if you were upset when you
I was
figured.
just confused. I'm like, so my guy signs up for what I thought was WRPF nationals, which
Well,
look,
it was WR. It was
yeah,
not to
there's
say what
a
you thought was. It was.
there's a web page for it and everything. And I'm like, okay, like so I go back so I knew what weekend he was competing on. We were far enough out where it's like, well, I'm not gonna, they were still figuring out the schedule and stuff or whatever. So it's like, well, I'll check on this in like a month and figure out what day he's on, and we'll start to line things up if we need to. Um, and then so time comes, I'm like trying to get a little more info on the meet, figure out, okay, is he competing in the morning, in the afternoon, what day is he on, all that stuff. And I cannot find the webpage. I'm looking for it on WRPF's website. I cannot find a WRPF Nationals. I'm like, what the fuck's going on? And so I'm looking around. I cannot find any information on this meet. The only thing I could find is a lifting cast, like an old lifting cast, like post of it of like day 2, and he's on like day 4. So couldn't find any info. Finally, I don't even remember what it. I think I ended up dropping it, and a couple weeks later I looked a little more, and I ended up finding out it's Powerlifting United. I checked their Instagram, all this stuff, and I found out about all that. I was like, what is going on? So I
Yeah.
finally figured it out, but yeah, it wasn't until like a month.
So for me, I mean, I remember when you were texting in the chat and we're asking about stuff. So basically, for me, is I have 6 people, maybe 7, depending on if the person switches to me for coaching right before I meet, which is always fun, the spur of the moment decision. Um, but I'll have multiple people doing it, some local, some far away, but they were all doing WRPF meets the same weekend.
Yeah.
And then the change happened and everyone got pushed over. So not only like did I see it in social media feed, because like I am fairly involved with what was the WRPF community here in Washington, but now has like every meet director's transitioned to Powerlifting United. So like everyone was posting about it, and then like my clients were like texting me being like, I just got an email about this that like it's switching over, and like what does this mean? So then I had to like talk to people, try to figure stuff out too, because I was like, I don't know. Like I'm finding out as you guys are finding out that everything is changing. But I mean, for the reasons that they did it, which sounds like neglectful leadership at the top of WRPF, and so meet directors just decided to form a separate federation to
Mhm.
serve their interests better. So if that's the case, and it's the people who are actually doing all the hard work and heavy lifting are getting treated fairly now, then that's what matters more to me. Like we said, supporting meet directors, not federations. Um, so yeah, but it was interesting time. It was a very panic induced couple of days when it first broke.
Yeah. Well, so I then look it up because I see on the lifting cast, it's like it's a St. Louis meet. It's Powerlifting United, which I'd never heard of, but it's a St. Louis meet. It's multiple days, whatever. And then so I go look it up on Instagram, and I remembered seeing like their announcement reel they posted. I remember being like, I think you sent that in the group chat. So that's what sparked it for me. I was like, oh, that was what he was referring to, this switch. So yeah, it was a confusing like
Yeah, for
week.
me, it doesn't affect. I mean, it affects obviously because, like I said, there was those few days of panic that people were having. But it in ours because our whole state, I think we have 4 meet directors here in Washington for WRPF, and then they all switched over to Powerlifting United. So like for us, it doesn't change anything. It's not like there's this meets Powerlifting United, this meets WRPF. It all switched for us.
Yeah. No, I
So
didn't switch anything for me either. Everything's the same. It's just now not WRPF, it's Powerlifting
yeah,
United. Same meet director, same venue, same days, all that. So it didn't really affect us at all, but it was very confusing for me. I was like,
yeah,
what's going on?
yeah. But it seems like it's for the best. I mean, it
Yeah, I
seems like
don't know
it's for
much
the
about
best.
the RPF, so
It seems like it's for the best for the lifters and the meet directors, which matters the most, I would say. But I mean, they made it at least a smooth-ish transition because like they honored all of the WRPF memberships for switching over. They didn't charge anyone like a
Mhm.
membership fee for the new federation or anything. So yeah, but
That's
hopefully it
good.
continues to ride out. I would only be curious to how it plays out for meets that are, I mean, not for meets, for states that are like not everyone flipped. And so there's like, if they had 6 meet directors and 4 of them flipped and 2 of them different, I would be interesting to see how that plays out in those states, but not something that I have to deal with or figure out. So I'm all good.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what the climate's like in the Midwest area. I know there was a WRPF meet. They hold like one or two a year, maybe in the Omaha area, but I don't know about the rest of
To
the
my
state.
to my knowledge, I would say the majority of meet directors and stuff switched because the WRPF page has like been super inactive since all this happened. I don't
Oh,
even think
really?
because like I mean, the Powerlifting United took their nationals, right? Like there's no WRPF nationals now; it's Powerlifting United nationals. But
Yeah.
not everyone switched. So I know that the let me look it up really quick. I think that the guy who was in charge posted something to the WRPF page. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick before we click and um no, never mind. He didn't put I thought there was a letter posted like publicly that people were able to see about what was kind of going on in transition of leadership and stuff like that. But I guess not. I read something at one point that must have just not been a post.
Yeah. Yeah, and it goes into the PA USAPL stuff too, where it's just so broken up. It hurts me, man. I hate that it's like that. It
Yeah. Yeah.
bums me out.
I mean, I don't know. I'm curious to see where things go with USAPL and Powerlifting United because I mean, you know as well as I do, there's been a lot of conversations about what people are going to do moving forward.
Hmm.
Obviously, in a perfect world, they would just recombine and then
Yeah.
abolish Article 14 and everyone could be happy again and they could figure out drug testing. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. So
Yeah.
just
I
have
remember, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say powerlifting is doomed to always be floundering with itself because of so many federations.
Dude, it's always been like this. Well, when I started, like there was no PA, obviously. So the test side was all USAPL. So it's like everyone who's in the tested side, power bar side of things got along. Everyone's
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
oh, we're all USAPL lifters. This is great. And now it's broken up. And I used to be a big fan of the sport at the high level where like I would actually tune in and watch Raw Nationals because I was just invested in it, right? But now that like everything's so broken up, it's hard to get into it as a fan and really
yeah,
follow the highest lifters because they're all in different federations. They don't compete against each other.
yeah.
So I don't know. It really it sucks for that in my opinion, but it is what it is. So
Yeah. I mean, I think, in personal opinion, I feel like after this upcoming year's Sheffield will be a lot more decisive to what people do.
yeah.
I think the USAPL has until then to kind of figure their shit out.
Yeah.
And if they can't get it figured out by then, um, I think they will probably suffer pretty heavily of losing more local meet directors because Sheffield is I mean, obviously worlds and stuff, but it's undeniably like where the eyes are right now. Sheffield,
Hmm.
Raleigh, meets like that are a lot more interesting to people. And I think that USAPL would do very well to capitalize on the collegiate scene that they have and trying to really elevate the collegiate side of the sport because they're clearly they're losing that open nationals, raw nationals presence, right? Like
Yeah.
it's obvious you go and you watch USAPL nationals, and obviously not across all weight classes. We still have very competitive lifters that would be competitive at the IPF stage in USAPL. But I do think that if the trend continues for another 6 months to a year, and we go through another national cycle, I think that those top level people are just going to continue to trickle over. And yeah, if you be a USAPL can't really retain that, then I think what at least they need to do is really capitalize on collegiate, teen, youth, and at least they can elevate that side of the sport to the next level, which will obviously, if you're willing to invest in the sport, in my eyes, as I see things, is that you have these collegiate level, team level, and you're really elevating the sport, and you're getting those people the resources they need to put on great meets for those younger demographic. Then in 5 years, you invest that time, you'll probably have USAPL, really high level, national junior open level lifters starting to transition and come in. But I think it takes the foresight for them to say we need to stop focusing on the wrong things and start focusing on either trying to really elevate this younger generation that we have a lot of and we can capitalize on, trying to elevate their side of the sport. I think trying to chase the IPF, which is seemingly what USAPL wants to do from what we've heard, but I don't think they can do anything other than lose people from going for that. No one in USAPL is there because they want to go to Worlds. If they want to go to Worlds, they transition,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into it too much, but I think the direction that the USAPL is taking at the highest level is maybe not in the best interest of like what the athletes across the federation would be interested in.
Yeah, and obviously there's lots of conversations to be had, and we've heard a lot from different people and meet directors and stuff. But I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how things transition. Powerlifting was totally different a year ago than it is now, and I'm sure it'll be totally different a year from today.
Yeah, yeah. We know the IPF, makes mistakes and has their faults that
Yeah, nothing.
controversies and stuff. So,
dude, it's been a controversial year.
Yeah. So yeah. So anyways, I feel like that's a good way to wrap things up. Where
Yeah,
can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram. I have two. I have Frazier Strength Systems and just my first name, Matyson. Both accounts there. I infrequently post on YouTube, but I suppose you could follow me there if you want to as well. I don't post on TikTok, so don't follow me on TikTok.
Follow him on TikTok, everyone. I'll link it all below. That'll all be below.
Sweet. Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. Good chats. It's always fun, I feel like, to kind of break away from the more like programming and like problem solving side of things every once in a while and just talk about the state of the sport and people getting into it and kind of what federations to look at. I think that stuff's always interesting, but it's hard to, you can't really make a post about that online. Like the state of powerlifting or something like that is a harder thing to not have a long form conversation about. So
30 slide info post on it. That's my
30 slide. It's just all 30 slide, all text.
Yeah. It's like the TSP meet recaps. It's a wall of text.
It's just the whole thing. It's just blue with yellow words on top of it for 30 slides.
It's an essay. It's like a 300-page essay. So anyways, appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, absolutely, man.